So as Lena said, I'll be talking about representation learning for something I'm calling narratives in social media. This is a new project. So you can think of this as kind of a position talk that's charting some or sketching out what we intend to be a moonshot for the Pioneer Center. And the targeted application here is preventing the spread of misinformation online. And that can involve multimodal data, can be text, images, other kinds of metadata, speech, and so on. And what we're aiming to do is to identify prevailing narratives that are present in that multimedia or multimodal content. We want specifically to learn a narrative-informed metric. This will allow us to compute meaningful distances between content that's being shared. We're not aiming for complete automation, so we aspire for this to be a human-in-the-loop system with humans of all different skill levels participating in different ways. One of the challenges in what we're proposing here is that narratives, which I'll be describing shortly, are unfalsifiable. So there's a lot of related work in natural language processing in particular that deals with structured knowledge representation for fact checking. And we're not doing that. We're looking at, in some sense, the complement of this. It's the unfalsifiable worldviews, opinions, claims that are difficult to check, but that are nonetheless part of the human mechanisms for sharing ideas and communicating. So there's a number of opportunities that exist if you had a mechanism for distilling content into narratives and comparing them. You could identify bot or sock puppet activity in organized misinformation campaigns, and you could predict or extrapolate narratives in novel settings. For example, anticipating a future pandemic or political candidates, like one or the other, winning an election and observing what narratives emerge. So the term narrative formally, if you look in literature, it refers to a somewhat formal structure where you have a story, a protagonist, villain, transformation, and so on. And we're actually not talking about that kind of narrative extraction. We're referring more to the kind of narrative that is discussed in viral content in social media. So an example screenshotted here, there's someone who has tweeted something about certain hotspots of venture capital and tech company activity in the US, Silicon Valley, New York City, Boston. These are the traditional areas of concentration for high-tech companies and investment. And then there's mentioning some small percentage of these other cities that many people on Twitter would have you believe are really giving those big three a run for their money. So this person makes a tweet and then someone identifies this as a narrative violation. So essentially what they're saying is, I'm hearing so many people talking about these cities, Austin and Miami, that are challenging the traditional Silicon Valley type places. And yet here are some facts, and this violates your narrative. Another example that's kind of highlighting the difference between facts and narratives. Someone has cited a statistic here. So this says it's comparing the percentages of plastic emissions that are provided by US, Canada, and Europe, and then they're comparing this to the Philippines. So this is something where there is a purported fact that is provided, and that is something that you could go check in a fact-checking context. But arguably that's kind of a wild goose chase, because it's really not about the fact that this person is providing, it's the narrative that's underneath this. So the narrative, there's some narratives that are probably advanced by that tweet. It could be that banning plastic straws is basically theater. It's a performative act, and it's worse. It's misleading people about the true sources of this kind of waste. And then you could imagine some narratives in opposition. And I'm guessing anyone here has heard these types of things discussed in a broader context, but you could say, well, this is an incomplete story, and that there's actual systematic export of plastic waste that's going from those countries to the Philippines for recycling. Or even if this is theater, we need to keep this on people's minds. And bear in mind, I'm not saying which of these narratives are true. This is really more about identifying prevailing narratives and being able to distill them or compute distances between them. There are cases where people actually distill narratives on their own. So here's an NLP researcher that tweets frequently and was observing several days worth of heated tweets about Israel and Palestine, and participating in those tweets in that dialogue. And then at some point went quiet for a while and then made this tweet that essentially, it's a partly sarcastic tweet, but is essentially offering a pair of narratives. And in this view, what he's saying is that storm of tweets that have happened over the last several days, they pretty much fall into one or the other category. So that represents the kind of narrative that we seek in this case. In terms of how this connects to visual representations, here's an example where a famous celebrity couple divorced. And when that news event transpired, all of the big news agencies needed to choose their headlines and the photo that they would run with that story. So the photo editors can decide, they may not realize it, but they're choosing photos to support this story that telegraph a certain narrative. And just informally, when I look at these photos, it seems to suggest that everything will be okay. This is somehow a mature couple that's handling the divorce in a constructive manner. Perhaps I'm reading too much into it, but these look like functional people that are presented in these photos. And it's interesting that not every divorced or divorcing celebrity couple gets that kind of treatment. So there's something transmitted through the choice of photos in this case. There's also cases where you have misrepresentation or out of context photos that are advancing certain narratives. So here we have a political candidate in the US who's opposed to a government program called Build Back Better. And they want to advance the narratives that Build Back Better is a failure and that it's resulting in grocery store shelves being empty. So they supplied an image that supports that narrative. But if you look closely, the currency here is not United States currency. It's actually pound sterling. And some people observed that when the tweet went viral, and then this person shortly thereafter took it down. So this is a case where you've got out of context photos advancing a narrative. Then I think it's important, another way to think about narratives is it's the quiet part. It's what's not said out loud. And so the one on the left, this is a meme, and you've got a combination of written statements and you have a visual. So the visual appears to capture some kind of racial harmony. So people of different ethnic groups shaking hands. And then you have individual statements that seem uncontroversial on their own. I support my Black friends, but not BLM. I support my white friends, but not the KKK, and so on. So this meme went viral. And one possible narrative here, a quiet part that's not said out loud, is that it is actually drawing an equivalence between BLM and KKK, Black Lives Matter and KKK. And this, you could imagine in the heated discussions on social media, somebody could see that post and then write a comment are you saying that Black Lives Matter is the same as KKK, or are you saying that Black Lives Matter is a hate group? And whoever posted it could say, no, I'm not saying that. That this doesn't actually say that. There are just 3 independent statements and then a platitude on the bottom. So this is a case where you could imagine in an appropriate space, this multimedia content could be represented, and you could observe that it's close to other narratives that are somewhat more explicitly worded. And it's important that we remember this isn't all about English, and we need to put this in the context of different cultures, because the narratives can completely turn on their head depending on where you are in the world. So shortly after I moved to Denmark, there was a pretty big soccer game that happened, and there was a big Danish soccer team victory, and there was a pretty rowdy celebration in the streets. And so this tweet popped up, and it's pointing out that there's a kind of spectacle that happens in the street, and it actually stopped traffic, and there were people dancing on this bus, and somebody raises an interesting question. What if this had been a pride type parade or a Muslim religious event? The responses would be completely different. And so this person is claiming that the media would go crazy if that, with judgment, if that type of thing were to happen. Again, I don't know whether that's true, but there's a certain narrative that is suggested here. And you could imagine if you were to take that photo and do some kind of A/B testing where you have the original one with the Danish soccer fans, and then you manipulate it to appear to be a different ethnic group, and the very same content in all other respects would trigger very different reactions and support different narratives. Now, that's some heavy content I'm talking about. And when it comes to getting new PhD students to work on this, I'm not going to say, I want you to solve the Israel-Palestine conflict. That is not going to be step number 1 in this project. We need to come up with some tractable initial sort of toy or toy plus problems that will let us understand this in a less contentious or heated environment. So I offer you this much simpler example where the story here is that you're in a public restroom, you've just washed your hands and your hands are wet, and now you need to dry your hands. And you have 2 choices. You have an air dryer on the left, or you have a paper towel dispenser. And I'll just remind you again, as I will do throughout this talk, this isn't about right or wrong. It's about prevailing narratives. It's about the gut feelings that people have in terms of why they make choices or how they identify with other social groups, for example. So I said this isn't as controversial as those political topics, but it turns out that hand drying has its share of controversies and conspiracies and so forth. Now, I look at this and it is crystal clear which format is better. I think there's no question in my mind which one I would go for. I'm not going to say what it is. And each of you looks at it and you're just thinking, of course, I'm going to do option A or option B. But what are those reasons? Well, if you do a little bit of searching, it turns out that as I mentioned, there are conspiracies. There's something called big paper and big hot air. So there's some very big money that can be made in these contracts depending on which format the restrooms use. And there are different perspectives on the part of the users, the business owners, the government, and so on. And you can, one of the major manufacturers of the air dryers is Dyson. And that company has been accused of misinformation campaigns, leading people to believe that one format is more hygienic than the other. So if we look at this as an example, here's an attempt to list some of the prevailing narratives around this topic. So these, you could imagine, these are written in a very dry form, but in some sense, these distill the worldviews that are present in tweets and Facebook comments and blog posts, newspaper articles, and so on. So things like air dryers are more hygienic, they cause skin chapping, or air dryers are loud. Paper towels help wipe hands clean. So this is, I had set this up as a simple experiment where people stated their preference and then gave reasons for it. Now, keep in mind, the people that are responding to the survey are not scientists in this area necessarily. They're not epidemiologists. They don't know about infectious disease, but they've read things and they have instincts and they have reasons for why they choose one or the other. And then beyond text, there are also memes. The younger the demographic, the more likely they are to use memes to express themselves. So here we have a combination of visual and text, and they can have sarcasm and contextual nuance. And importantly, the memes offer, beyond this specific subspace of narratives that have to do with hygiene, memes are actually a language of their own. There are meme templates. So those of you familiar with meme language might recognize the hat on the left. So there's where it says wet hands, there's a little hat, and that hat is known as the scumbag Steve hat. So it's a part or attribute that's present in a meme. And if it's there in a meme, it implies a certain kind of sarcasm and irritating behavior. And it actually will offer an opportunity to connect narratives across very different domains. The idea being that as you grow your narrative knowledge base, you could have all kinds of NLP style analysis that's happening within those subdomains. And then you could use the meme template to create connections between different discussion topics and do things like domain transfer or help with the cold start problem in terms of identifying narratives. Now, this is not meant to be a short-term project. We're aiming for this to be a moonshot, kind of a 10-year plus kind of project that is not solely an AI research problem. It's really something that involves journalists, historians, computer scientists, simply the reader base, the users, the readers of the content, social media users, and so on. So there's a gigantic amount of related work that's present here. Again, I would argue that the unfalsifiable nature of memes makes it somewhat different. So it's kind of if you think about the fact-checking literature, the veracity detection step often has some kind of quantification of check worthiness. So if a statement came in like water boils at 100 degrees Celsius at sea level, that is a purported fact, and you could go into a fact-checking database and it would land quite well there. So something like that is not going to land in a narrative analysis framework. So we're looking for things that are kind of the opposite of that, but not everything. As I mentioned, this is meant for preventing the spread of misinformation. So this is the kind of project that needs to be done together with companies like Facebook and Twitter, where there's a certain virality threshold that means some kind of potential misinformation campaign is happening. It's worth examining. It appears to consist of a very diverse, large group of people expressing opinions, but let's do some kind of narrative analysis to figure out if in fact there's a relatively small number K of narratives that are present in what's being shared. In terms of related work, one of the closest things to this is work out of UW, the University of Washington, on something called social chemistry. And here, what they're dealing with is something like manners, basically. If you think of a case where you have roommates and you have a blender and you choose to run it at 5 in the morning, this is also something where there's no absolute right or wrong, but you could imagine a system that has a large data set of these judgments and actions, and that in this case, that particular situation of running the blender at 5 a.m. was not present in the training set, but they're able to determine that this is bad social chemistry and that there's an explainability component. It's rude to make loud noises early in the morning. So this is something where the underlying, in this case, transformer-based representations for the statements could be applicable in our setting. From the human computation standpoint, there's a long tradition of games out there like ESP game, Taboo, Family Feud, and so on. So there's many types of games with a purpose that are out there that essentially benevolently trick people into providing richer and more varied descriptors for image content. And we imagine this could also be used for tweets and Facebook comments and so on. From my group, in collaboration with Facebook, we've also studied things, something we call intentonomy. And this has to do in the context of Instagram. Why is it that people post what they post? What is it that they're trying to transmit through their choice of photo? For example, showing success in having a good job, or a healthy lifestyle, or artistic predilections. So we worked with social psychologists to produce a populated data set we call intentonomy. And as you see in this figure 1, there are cases where, if you look at this in terms of triplet-based representation, you may have image representations that at the pixel level look quite similar, but are actually transmitting different intent. So the harmony example, you see someone doing perhaps stretches before yoga, or relaxing by a creek, and that transmits harmony, but the images themselves are quite different. And so this is just a reminder that we need to take into account some of these latent intent states that are not just a matter of looking at the pixels. We've also done this type of work in the context of combining human and machine expertise. So we have a technique, I'm going to skip this in the interest of time, but a technique for gathering so-called triplet-based data, in this case, for expressing your opinion on how similar different foods taste. So this is a user interface where somebody's presented a probe image, in this case, carrots, and then a gallery on the right. And they are asked to imagine how the food tastes and click on images that seem closest in some kind of taste space. So once again, it's not about pixel or texture or color similarity. It's about some kind of abstract, inferred characteristic of the image, in this case, the taste of the food. And we want to solve an optimization problem that produces a concept embedding. And then if successful, you can produce a kind of visual menu of taste, things that would taste similar would be near each other in that space. So that is something that we intend to apply in the context of this narrative extraction. Obviously, there's a big challenge in that when it comes to the crowd work campaigns, looking at pages of text is not quite as compelling as looking at galleries of images. So the human visual system it functions very well in parallel. So you can show these grids of, say, 25 appetizers and have people click on similar tasting appetizers fairly quickly. We want to do something like that for narratives and comments that have been semi-automatically extracted from Twitter, Facebook, and so on. but there's only so much that people can read on a screen. So this is something that we need to think about from a UX or HCI perspective. And so let me go back to the, sorry, my screen froze here. Okay. So I'm going to wrap up here, and I want to save some time for discussion. There, we're at the beginning of something that we're crafting into a moonshot project for Pioneer Center. We're digging into this particular sub area of hygiene in order to produce sets of narratives, identify them in discussions online and in articles. But as this scales to a large set of narratives, we need to figure out how to source those narratives. Do they get crowdsourced? Are they semi-automatically extracted from NLP style parsing methods? We need to figure out how to mobilize the crowds that are relevant for annotating the training data. And as I mentioned before, there's a massive body of work out there on conventional fact-checking research. So there is a kind of left brain, right brain distinction implied in this project, that somehow there are people who reason in terms of facts and people who reason in terms of gut feeling narratives. We'd eventually like to reconcile this in the sense that if you have done prevailing narrative distillation, it would be nice then to connect that with fact check data sets and show which facts support which narratives. But before we do that, I think it's very important to have a well-defined internal representation for narratives. Needless to say, sarcasm, humor, nuance, those are huge problems already in NLP, and all of those flow into this narrative extraction problem in full force. So there's nothing new we have to say about those problems. It's just that they're going to be haunting us throughout this project. And it's fashionable to have these sort of X to Vec approaches. A lot of people they make things like wave to Vec or word to Vec types of approaches. It's not clear that that is sufficient. We may need something that's inherently graph-based in the representation. It's not clear yet what the representation will look like. So those are just a few of the issues that have popped up while we're formulating this problem. But yes, as I said, this is just at the beginning stages, but that is what I wanted to present. And I thank you for your attention.